Now we're into some controversial waters. Immigration. We'll look at this in two parts, really. The second part, we'll look at the 1960s, Enoch Powell and everything. And you'll have to say, I'm sorry about the language at times, but I will actually use some pretty offensive language because I have to. Because I have to quote what people actually said at the time. It's also, as an introductory remark, to say if we're looking for some of the greatest changes in these years, of British history, the entry into Britain of people of an Afro-Caribbean and Southeast Asian or Indian subcontinent extraction is one of the biggest social changes we come across. And we've got to be careful to not overestimate the extent of it, as well as not to underestimate the extent of the change it will make in British society. I think it's worth just remarking just at the outset, that again, don't overdo it. The Britain I grew up in Essex in the 50s, when I started secondary school, there wasn't a single black or Asian family in the school. There were a few, and I mean literally, I think it's 4 by the time I left in 1978. So we're still talking something that was outside of the cities, I think, still sort of quite small and quite hard to notice, but it was undoubtedly noticeable. We'll say more about that when we talk about the 60s and the 70s. Famously, we all say immigration began with the Empire Windrush, which came over from Jamaica in 1948. It didn't. Okay, there'd been immigration before that, and Windrush was just a big news story at the time. It just attracted a lot of attention, but it is kind of symbolic. What's more important was the British Nationality Act of 1948, in which the Attlee government gave British nationality and the right of abode in Britain to all Commonwealth citizens. It actually effectively gave British citizenship in a way to every single Commonwealth citizen. Interestingly, pretty much almost immediately after Windrush, we now know from secret cabinet papers, despite the fact the numbers were tiny, we're talking hundreds of people at this stage, Labour went into an absolute blind panic about it. I mean, total panic. And considered introducing measures to restrict immigration there and then. And I think that should remind us that a kind of racism would pervade quite a bit of British society, more of which in a moment. Let's do the numbers, shall we? So in the 1940s, around 240,000 people came to live in the United Kingdom. Of course, the majority of them after 45, for fairly obvious reasons. In the 50s, we get up to about 676,000. In the 60s, about 1.24 million. In the 50s, about half of those immigrants were non-white, and they were what called New Commonwealth. We'll talk about that in a minute. By the end of the 60s, the majority of people coming into the country were of Asian, mostly extraction, actually, by that stage. But interestingly, through most of this period, numbers leaving were more than double, or by 1970, less than double, but still much larger than those coming in. It's just that those leaving were white in the main. Those coming in, about half of them weren't white. Where were they from? Well, we said before, the first wave of immigrants were Afro-Caribbeans, a lot of the time classically working in hospitals, on transport. The cliches of the Afro-Caribbean nurse, or the train announcer at White Hart Lane, who I remember very affectionately from when I was a boy in the 60s with his rich Barbadian accent telling us the train was from Bishop Stortford. Many of those actually were veterans, oddly enough, from the war. From the mid-50s, though, there also began a wave of immigrants from the Indian subcontinent. Where did they end up? Well, immigrants always end up where other immigrants are, and the immigrants always start in places it's relatively cheap to live and easy to get jobs. There's a logic in them hills, isn't there? So, we're talking about places like poor bits of London, Notting Hill. Poor bit of London, it was then. West London, South London, Brixton would be another famous example. We're talking Asians, we might say Bradford, the mill towns of Lancashire, or Slough out in Berkshire. And what comes with that, of course, is where you get the first immigrants going into those, you get other immigrants following them, because there will be people who can speak the languages, who have their culture, have the food, the music, and that can create the illusion of the language that get used at the time of being swamped. It also has an immediate effect in those localities, of course, on job markets, because immigrants will often accept lower pay, and because, of course, they come to take the jobs. Now, the joke is, of course, these were jobs primarily that were short. There was a labour shortage in this period. We needed immigration, but If you haven't got a job, and it might not have a job because you're not much good, you might look across the road and see the black person or the Asian person and say it's their fault. So you get that tension rising as well. That I mentioned before, Rackman, when I talked about housing. Well, the process of kicking out white tenants and replacing, say, a white family of 4 with a series of black young men who you're sticking 2 or 3 to a room, or indeed Irish young men sticking 2 or 3 to a room, well, that changes the nature of an area. And of course, when you're black young men, or Irish young men, or just young men full stop, you're not going to sit around in the evening knitting or thinking about the public sector borrowing requirement, are you? You're going to go out. So these young men have got money in their pocket. They haven't got much to spend it on, to much sense, apart from sending some home. So the money gets spent in the pubs and the clubs. Young men out on the town with a bit of money. Young women, black men, white women. We begin to get some social problems. A lot of that revolves around, well, there's no other way of putting this, racism. The Britain I grew up in was just dead racist. Honestly, it really was. Came in 2 kinds. Most racism in Britain was a kind of lazy racism. I'd say my dad had that. I always have joke people I teach, don't know, about fess up your racist relative. Well, it's a kind of lazy thing. They're different from us, and all the cliches, all the blacks have got rhythm, all that kind of stuff that was very much prevalent at the time. Then there, of course, were those much more actively racist. You get this coming to the fore, basically. It's pretty evident. Signs on landladies' doors, no coloureds, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. And then you get it amongst the sort of youth cult at the time, the white youth cult, Teddy Boys as they were known, more of which another time. But they were pretty racist. There was actual White Defence League, for example, and I've got to say the police could be pretty capable of being racist as well. The upshot of all this was in 1958, Britain's first race riots broke out. Most famously in Notting Hill. That's the bit that really got on telly, but they were in other bits of London, places like Nottingham, Bristol. And for the first time, you could see on TV, images of police battling both black and white youths, petrol bombs being thrown, bricks being chucked, all the usual stuff you might associate with riots. Now, the Home Secretary at the time, Rab Butler, responded as Home Secretaries always do when there are riots. He talks tougher sentences, and indeed the 9 white ringleaders in Notting Hill received very long prison sentences. He also did what good Home Secretaries do and commissioned an inquiry, and it was called the Salmon Report. And Salmon leapt to some rather basic conclusions. Sorry, bad joke. But he saw the 58 riots as primarily a law and order issue. The report didn't directly suggest immigration controls, but that's the conclusion the government drew. Immigration was now a political problem. Now, first of all, you've got to admit there's some racist politicians. Actually, Churchill, okay, he's a creature of the Edwardian era, but he talked about the white Britain would be a good election slogan. He also talked about the horror of the Magpie Society. There was definitely a strongly anti-immigrant and racist element in the Conservative Party among the backbenchers. There was an organisation called the Monday Club, a right-wing pressure group, which was really keen, by the way, on apartheid South Africa and Ian Smith's all-white Southern Rhodesia. And race would come to play an increasingly large part in British politics. I've flagged up an article about the Smethwick election in the general election of 1964. And that will feed through, of course, the famously Enoch Powell in the 60s. And the popular slogan at the time, which was said on the doorsteps, apparently, rather than vote Labour and get a nigger for your neighbour. It got that bad. I can certainly remember racist politicians knocking on doors in the 70s, for example. Then there was social dislocation in some communities with large-scale immigration. Notting Hill, West Midlands, there was. And a substantial proportion of the wider population feared immigration. Many of them were actually racist, in a lazy way mainly, but nonetheless they were. So Butler was one of the first of many Conservative Home Secretaries to find himself in a political bind. The result was the Commonwealth Immigration Act, or Immigrants Act, of 1962. This sought to specifically limit black and Asian immigration. So it is actually a racist measure. New Commonwealth immigration was the phrase for those from the Indian subcontinent and the West Indies. Butler was pretty reluctant, and I think did it mainly under political pressure. Labour were opposed to it, though they actually would introduce a tougher act in 1968, and there would be further immigration on nationality acts under Heath, Thatcher, and indeed Cameron. In that light, maybe Butler's not quite so bad as he's sometimes made out to be. And Butler's act was maybe more measured than some. The irony is, though, the delay it took to get the act through saw a big rush of immigration, over 200,000, through 1961 and 62. Worse was to come. And when we come to look at the 60s, and we'll look specifically at Enoch Powell and the Rivers of Blood and race in the 60s and 70s, it could get pretty bloody horrible, to be frank. What we've not told is the optimistic story yet. I'm going to save that for the 60s and what's called the Race Relations Acts of the 68 and then of 74. Meanwhile, toodaloo.